Hello, this is this week's recording, or this week's lecture. I am wondering if you guys wouldn't mind letting me know after you watch this, did you see the Teams meeting in your meeting calendar? Like I told you last week, it is a regular occurrence and it should be showing up. You should also be getting reminders, and I did send one out, but it should be coming automatically from the system as well. If you guys are not getting those reminders for this, please let me know, and I will work with the tech guys and see what we can do to resolve that issue. It does make it a lot easier if at least a few people show up for the meeting, so we have some sort of interaction. And I'd really appreciate it if you guys could do what you need to, so that as many as possible can participate in these live sessions. Last week we talked a little bit about some of the aspects of divided mind, being aware of what, when I was younger, what they used to talk about, the right and left hemisphere of the mind. I think one of the cool things that were spoken about was the idea of slow motion multitasking. I think that's kind of cool. And we'll talk about that more later on. But the whole idea of slow motion multitasking is when you are doing multiple things over time. Multitasking, the way that it's typically thought, really doesn't work that well, because a lot of the times we have a certain amount of transition time when we switch from one task to another, and that transition time really takes up a lot of the energy from the original task. And so the problem with multitasking is that we're actually just switching our focus rapidly. We're not really doing several things at once. We're doing a little bit of this, then a little bit of that, and a little bit of another thing. And every time we switch, we have to readjust our thinking. But slow motion multitasking is quite a bit different, and this is something that all of us do all the time, and it's evidence of higher order thinking as well, where we do something for a while, then we put that into the back of our minds when we go to something else. When you have your course schedule, you'll have several different classes, and they're all going to be on different subjects. You're not multitasking in the traditional sense as you're jumping from one thing to another. You're giving yourself time to switch your focus. But what that also does is, while you are focused on whatever the present task is for a significant length of time, the other stuff that you also have significant focus on is in the background of your mind. And what this allows you to do is to process and think in your downtime about multiple different things at once. And it actually has been shown to help people come up with solutions. When you engage your subconscious, it does help quite a bit to resolve situations through out-of-the-box thinking or non-linear thinking that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do. And that's something that we'll address more later on. But for this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about why art is important, how we think about art, and then touch on something called the flow state. Now, your assignment includes things like drawing horse upside down. And this actually is an awful lot easier if you can engage your flow state instead of thinking about it analytically, because that makes it quite a bit more difficult if you think about it completely analytical. If you consider that it's not a horse and you just copy the lines as they are and stop thinking about what the picture makes up, it makes it actually a lot easier to do, which is kind of an interesting thing. There's some questions that I want you to think about. And this is evidence of what I mentioned earlier, just a moment ago, about a slow motion multitasking. What's your major? What focus do you have as you are engaging in your university career? What job do you have? Are you fortunate enough that you don't need to have a full-time job? Are you able to engage in a part-time job? What kind of job is it? Is it a job that you are taking because you have to? Is it a job that you enjoy? Or is it a job that you originally took because you had to, and now you've adapted your thinking so you actually enjoy it? What kind of career do you want to have later on in life? When you move forward to engage in a job or career, what are the primary concerns that you have? Aside from the income you make, what are the other factors that you've taken? For me, whenever I've worked to get or worked at a job, some of the things are, well, to be completely honest, the first job that I had as a grown-up person was an early morning janitorial job, and I took it because I had to. And it ended up actually being a really good experience. Sometimes we have to do things because we have to do them, and we can't get around that. But I also started thinking, I really don't like the feeling of being forced to come to work. So I started trying to make stories in my head about how important it was that I was doing, or seeing if I could get a certain number of tasks done, trying to gamify it somehow so it was less miserable and a little bit more enjoyable. And to be completely honest, it wasn't entirely successful, but it did help me alter my thinking a little bit about the necessity to work. And subsequent jobs, I tried to find elements within them that I could really enjoy and focus on and improve on. And there were some things still that are pretty miserable to look back at that I did not enjoy, but there are other things that I've reframed how I remember them, so they don't seem quite so miserable now. When we talk about career choices, a primary consideration most of us have is the income. And when we talk about serving or helping others, one of the primary considerations we think about is include food and shelters. Food and shelter, excuse me. Now, art may not necessarily be the most lucrative choice we can have to engage our time. And it may not seem like it could serve a lot of people in those basic needs of providing food and shelter. But art provides some sort of return anyway that may not be immediately measurable as profound levels of income or I guess a good word for it is nourishment in direct bodily ways. There is something to be said when the mind is engaged that seems to be consistent for somebody's mental and long-term health. That seems to be right up there with the necessity for food and shelter. When people no longer have hope, no longer have desire to continue, no longer see any sort of future, then generally their body stops responding in healthy ways to things like shelter and nutrition. We see that a lot in particularly people that have terminal or ongoing illnesses. It seems that if they don't have any sort of a support network or any sort of focus to continue, they don't respond nearly as positively to the treatments that they're given. There are a number of different reasons for art. And I think I want to just briefly express there's a lot of different definitions for art that are around there, out in the ether, so to speak. And we may have touched on this last week a bit. But art, I think, is an exercise we engage in to communicate outside of the restrictions of language. All of us have a desire to build or to grow or to do something additional to whatever we absolutely have to. And I think art engages that aspect of it. And I hope that you don't think of art only as making baskets or writing poems or creating music or painting or drawing or any of those things. I think art is pretty much any activity that we can engage in, or the evidence of any activity we can engage in, which allows something else to help us, for lack of a better phrase, to create something. Sometimes that something else is memories of other things that we've done, and engaging our experience, engaging our creativity to find new ways of doing things. And this can apply to pretty much any activity we engage in. If you're farming, paying attention to the land and trying to feel the land, and asking that numinous portion of yourself, which really doesn't think in words, how do I best do this? Looking at your past experience. So even farming can generate or can be an art activity. Teaching definitely is. Rock climbing could be. Just walking, when you engage your senses and enjoy the world around you. Trying to look for opportunities to build or create or to act where you engage something beyond your present conscious self, I think could qualify it as art. And there's also some other reasons that are in this module. One is it preserves culture. Art can be used to create artifacts that become symbols and records of a culture. We can see that very specifically looking through art history. We can see artifacts that's particularly the farther back you go in history, or further back you go in history, the way we know now about civilizations and cultures that are long gone is through the art that they left behind. Art also documents history. Art reflects how people are responding to their present culture at the point of creation. I think the example in our module shows of Van Gogh painting an outdoor cafe. He was very much a product of his time. Pete Mondrian, same is true of him. He was, it's a little bit more difficult to appreciate his work. It's all vertical and horizontal lines, but he was reacting to this kind of depression felt by a lot of people that just the world was moving way too fast. And so he was trying to simplify it in a symbolic way through his art. Picasso and the Cubism that he was doing, same kind of thing. He was trying to express his way of processing the fast-paced world around him. And we can see that a lot. I think we can even go to like TikTok and Instagram and look at what people are doing. They're engaging technology and trying to create something that is very indicative of the present moment. So it's art as a documentation of current history. Art can also address ideas, like I mentioned earlier, that are beyond the reach of our words. We can create something, build something. Somebody else across the country or across time can see what we've made and kind of catch a glimpse a little into how we think by looking at the art that we've left for them. It's a way of bridging time. It's a great way of bridging distance to kind of share ideas that help people to think about things that maybe they wouldn't normally think of, at least not in that way. I really like the idea that art elicits wonder. What is kind of fun is if next time you go into a museum and you see children there, just watch their eyes and see how they respond to the things around them. And as you engage those tools of artistic critique that we talked about and really engage yourself in trying to describe and experience the art, you'll find yourself spending more time with it and it becomes more interesting and exciting to you. I think art as well is valid and important for any field. if art is evidence of that act of creation, where somebody does something, pulling in something out beyond their present self, then that can be true of any field. Engineering is a really good example for this, or math, um, physics. I think it's interesting. You talk to some people that are right on the leading edge of theoretical physics, and how they talk about what they're learning and what they're trying to document. It sounds like they're describing art. It's really amazing. Or you talk to somebody who's an electrical engineer, and have them describe what power means to them or what energy means to them. And it's fascinating because they use a lot of the same language that we're coming across as we study art. Now, creativity is something that also informs reality. When Star Trek, those TV shows first came out 60 years ago, there were a lot of things in them that were just absolutely fantastic science fiction. But there's a TV show that you can watch. I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but William Shatner was asked to narrate. He was the guy who played the original Captain Kirk. He was asked to narrate and produce some a short series done by the History Channel, I believe, about how Star Trek created the universe. And the cell phone that we have today is a direct result of a young kid watching Star Trek in the 60s and deciding he was going to become an engineer and create the cell phone. And then that's what he did. He created the flip phone. And I thought that was fascinating because I remember when you could start getting ringtones, and people started getting flip phones with the ringtone that sounded like the Star Trek communicator. So it came full circle. NASA right now is experimenting with deep space propulsion that they're calling the ion drive, that the idea came to them and they started exploring it specifically because of the Star Trek science fiction. It was mentioned, I think, the ion drive was mentioned, I think, in the second season of Star Trek. And that's just an example of Star Trek. But if you look at the Sacred Family Cathedral in Spain, that whole thing, it was actually built, but it was built from a person's dream. And it was absolutely fascinating. And so there are things in our real world that are engaged and becoming reality specifically because they were informed originally by art. And I just think that's absolutely fascinating. But what other reasons can you think of as to why art might be important? I think when we engage that creative part of ourselves, we can engage that outside of just our production to find ways of resolving issues in our own chosen career fields. I think that using the four tools of artistic critique can help us to resolve issues from, if we're a long haul trucker, all the way to dealing with math. When we use those four steps, which we'll talk about in just a moment, mostly because these four steps are a way of giving an outline to a process of critical thinking. Now, this next section asks the question, is there a right way to think about art? I remember coming across something that somebody had written, an art critic had written this in the 1950s. That's not when I read it. I was born a little bit later. But he said something that I thought was really interesting. He said something along the lines of, art becomes valuable only when you can get it in 3 to 5 seconds. And I thought, well, that's pretty awful. The attention span of a goldfish, I think, is about 5 seconds. And the attention span of a lot of people today is averaging a little bit less than that, which is pretty sad. But I think that's one of the reasons why we see all these moving ads and everything like that all the time. Whenever we're on the computer, it seems like something is trying to compete for our attention. Whenever we use our phone, something's trying to compete for our attention because there's not an awful lot of focus there. We're always looking for something to give our attention to. I think that there is a correct way to think about art. I think there's a correct way to experience art. Now, we could easily just glance at art and go on. You know, that's what a lot of people do. But one of the things that I think is true with art that I think that we need to be mindful of its truth is the fact that somebody somewhere took the time to make it. And just as we hope that other people don't dismiss our efforts offhand, I think it's appropriate to show or to demonstrate a little bit of awareness of the fact that somebody else, somewhere else, made that thing that we're interacting with. If we're able to describe something, or if we're able to appreciate how it came to be the way it is, if we're able to use our imaginations and start to gather a little bit of why it is the way it is, maybe a little bit of the reason behind it, and then we're able to put all those things together and assess whether or not it's beneficial to us, or it's successful, or it's the solution that it presents is viable, then I think that overall is very beneficial. Last week, we talked a little bit about what critical actually means. Critical does not mean harsh and nasty. Critical means doing it with intent. And if we're critiquing something, we're discussing it with intent. We're discussing it on purpose. And as we move forward with the subject of art, we need to try as hard as we can to separate ourselves from the negative connotations of these words like critic, critique, and critical. These ideas within the realm of art that we're exploring are intended to help us as we engage with art, as we look at it, as we examine it, as we think about it. And it helps to consider art as another mode for not just expression, but for communication. Now, as we are using our purposeful or intentful thinking powers to appreciate art and to engage with it, I think that we can also I think we will also benefit in other aspects of our living. We talked about how to appreciate and understand art, but that also applies to how we can appreciate and understand situations that we're in at work, maybe issues with our own families, experiences that we have to engage with in our everyday life. I think it can help us if we choose to let it. It can quite a lot of things. And I want to go through and just demonstrate, maybe show a little bit of the 4 steps of critical artistic critique that we mentioned last week. I want to just touch on them a little bit. And I want more than anything else for you to have them in the back of your head as we are moving forward in this class to hopefully generate habits of thinking that can apply to other things that you do in addition to art. I'm going to share my screen on this. Let's see if we can do this. It looks like everything froze up. Hold on just a second. Let me see if I can engage this. Here we go. I'm hoping you can see this on your screen. The first step of those 4 tools, or the first tool of those 4 tools of artistic critique, as we talked about last week, is describe. Now, when we look at this, it is an interesting photograph and we can just dismiss it. But what happens when we seek to describe it? Not even necessarily trying to describe it to somebody else, just trying to describe it in our own minds. We start looking at shapes, we start looking at colors and forms, we start looking at relative sizes within it. Okay, we can, it looks like this is a stairwell. It looks like it's a spiral stairwell or a spiral staircase. It looks to me like we can describe this as a series of horizontal planks that are stair steps spiraling around a central axis, and this view looking like they're going down. We get an idea for size because we see that hand on the left-hand side that's on the railing. So this railing is also spiral, and the railing is perhaps maybe 3 or 4 inches across, probably 3 inches across. And each of those braces connecting the handrail, the curving handrail, with the stair steps are probably 1 inch or so wide. So you can see as there is the stair steps themselves are white, and it looks like there's probably red carpet down the middle of them as something of a runner. We can also see that the railing perhaps is a wood color maybe, but we can look down this railing. We also see that there's some curved brickwork on the left-hand side, and that has maybe a beige and a white and a gray. And we can see that it looks like some other people are down the next floor down that are walking as well up towards us. And we can see how the change in their size are a little bit smaller. It gives us an idea of the perspective that we're looking through. Okay, so on one instance, we can just look at this and move on. But when we start trying to describe it, that engages us a little bit more, and we can spend a little bit more time, and we can end up appreciating it a little bit more because we have looked at it longer. Now, if we go down to analyze, analyze is the next step. The describe, we're talking about how that thing impacts our senses and impacts the shared physical world. When we analyze, we're going to talk a little bit about, or explore a little bit about, how do we think it was made? How do we think it was put together and formed? Now, this is a very cool stick structure made by somebody named Patrick Doherty. And we can look at this and describe it as, it looks like it's made out of sticks. It looks like the window in front of us is maybe 2 feet by 2 feet. It looks like these sticks may be about 1/4 to 1/2 inch in diameter, so that gives us a sense of scale. And it looks like they're woven together. Now, when we start analyzing this, how is it woven together? It looks to me like the sticks, for the most part, especially if we see the right and left of that window, it looks like they're kind of wound together a little bit and then folded over. And in that window, it looks like somehow the sticks have been woven together and then the ends stuck into the wall that was made. And maybe the wall was made by folding sticks over and weaving them together so that the tension that weaving causes kind of holds them in place. And when we start analyzing that, we start realizing, wow, this actually took some effort to put together. We start appreciating a little bit of the solidity of this object. It is stable enough. It was created in such a manner that it is stable enough to support its own weight, and it's strong enough that we can walk through it. Now, the next step, we're injecting that. So for the analyze step or the analyze tool, we are exploring a little bit of the how that something is made. So here we describe the what. Here we analyze the how. When we go down, the next one is interpret. This we start thinking about the why. Why is an artist doing that? Now in this, Joseph Kossuth was addressing an idea. Well, let's describe what we see. We see some writing on a wall. We see a chair, and to the left of the chair, we see a photograph of the same chair, about the same size. If we analyze it, the printing, it looks like the printing was copied onto some paper that was thumbtacked to the wall. It looks like the chair was made by somebody else and set up against the walls, unfolded and placed there. And then it looks like the photograph was a picture taken of this chair. It looks like in the same setting, processed, and then printed out large size onto this paper so that the size matches pretty close to the actual chair that's sitting there. So we've analyzed that a little bit. So the photographic and printing processes were used, as well as an actual chair. Now, when we get into the interpret stage, we are starting to think about why is the artist doing this. The title of this gives us a clue. It's called 1 and 3 chairs. Well, the 1 chair is the chair right in front of me, I think. But is that true? That is true, but it's not all the truth. Next to that 1 chair that we see is another chair. It's a photo of the chair. We say, well, maybe it's not a real chair. Well, it's just as real as the image that we're seeing of the central chair. Because from our perspective, all of this is a photo. So it's a representation of the chair in a photo or a flat plane. And then to the right is a definition of the chair. Well, that's not a real chair, is it? Well, wait a sec. That's the definition that we use to determine whether or not something is a chair. So it is as much a chair. It's not as practical of a chair as the one that's right in the center, but it is much of a chair as that is, because it is the definition of a chair. It's the thing that we use to evaluate whether or not something is a chair. So why is Joseph Kosuth doing this? Already then, if we talk about how is this 3 chairs the same chair, how are they related? How are these things, how do they fit together? Then we start thinking, well, oh, hi, Nicola. How long have you been there?
I actually just came on not too long, like a couple minutes ago.
Okay, all right, good. You are catching me in midstream, but we'll keep going.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for showing up. Now, can you see, I'm doing screen share. Can you see this image of
Yes,
1
I
and
see
3
the
chairs?
chairs. Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, I'm talking about the 3 stages or the 4 tools of artistic critique: describe, analyze, and interpret. And I think I pick this image for the interpret because in interpret we are addressing the why of a piece of art. And I think this gives us a really good idea of what Joseph Kosuth is doing with the why. Because when you look at this and you see the title 1 and 3 chairs, what is the first thing you start thinking inside your head?
You said what's the first thing I start thinking when I see those 2 chairs?
Yeah. I think that the first question all of us ask is why? How can this be considered art? Why is this art? And I think that speaks directly to the interpretation tool of artistic critique, because then we start wondering, how is Joseph justifying this as art? And this actually is an example of conceptual art, which is art specifically designed to make us think about why something is considered art. And in the interpretation tool, we are asking ourselves questions about why do you think the artist may have made this, or why did they do it? And in this case, we're adding to that, why is he claiming that this is art? Well, this is, one, it is something that is set up in a gallery. So we're prepared to accept it as art because we've gone into the gallery expecting to see art. But also, I think it's dealing with art because it's asking us to kind of engage in a conversation with the artist that may not be something that we can limit entirely to language. When we look at this, we can see the one chair. It's right there in the middle. And then can you see the three chairs?
The three, I see two chairs with the explanation of one.
Yeah. And so how can we justify, or how can we identify this explanation of a chair as another chair? You know, if we consider a definition of a chair is what we use to qualify something, an object we interact with as a chair, then
Yeah.
that really contributes to the reality of the chair too, somehow. You
Yeah,
know, the idea of the definition. What's that?
I would say like as we read the description, we're kind of like picturing the image in our mind, so it kind of creates another chair, even though it's not. It's like a different type of chair.
Yeah, I like that. Very good. And that's important. It's a different type of chair because on the left, this is a chair as well, but it's a different type of chair. It's a photo representation of a chair. And then in the middle is a third type of chair. It is also a chair, but it is the physical chair. So we got the physical chair, the image of a chair, and then the imaginary chair or the imagination of a chair. So yeah, excellent. Very good. And then the fourth step, I have some questions here as you go through to just ask yourself about when you interpret something. But the fourth step is evaluating. Is the artwork successful? And when we evaluate something, it's important that that comes last after we've had a chance to look at it, describe it, analyze how it was put together, and interpret a bit as to why the creator made it. This is the Pieta, Michelangelo's. It's an image of Mary holding her son Jesus, who is very dead, in her lap moments after he was taken from the cross in the narrative. And it was chiseled out of stone and then polished and, just very, very carefully made. Now, when we look at this, the questions about whether or not it's successful, I think, are really valid. I think one way of knowing this is successful is it's endured through time. I mean, it is still valid and relevant today as it was when it was first made. But what are some of the other questions we can ask ourselves as to whether or not this art is valid or this art is successful? I think one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, does it demonstrate the artist's capacity to work with the medium? I think, the answer to that is, yeah, absolutely. We can tell exactly what it is. And if we get other images that are closer up to it, we can tell that the person who created it really knew their stuff when they were working with stone. What are some of the other questions we can ask whether to help us evaluate whether or not this art is successful? I think another question we can ask is it something that we can connect to? Do we kind of understand the narrative of what is being shown us in the art? And sometimes art is not designed to create a narrative that we can understand, but in this case, I think we very definitely can connect with the narrative. We know what's going on. We can see what's going on. I think another question we can ask is the material consistent for its use? And if the use in this instance is for people to enjoy it and see it for a long time, then the choice of material, the marble, is exactly right for that, because carved marble will last for an awful long time. So I think from that perspective, it's also successful. Does the art convey something outside of words? Does it convey emotion? And I think that looking at this, knowing what the subject matter is, because we can identify the human form who's deceased right here, and the human form who's contemplating that body, I think we can connect with it a little bit on an emotional level. All of us have experienced loss. All of us have been forced to confront that idea of loss. And this is another way of us illustrating that process. And I think it's successful on that level too. Is there, Nicole, can you think of any other kind of question you could ask yourself as to whether or not this piece of art is successful as a piece of art? Oh, I'm sorry, it looks like the connection was lost. Connection has been a little bit goofy. I don't know if you noticed earlier, everything froze up for a bit, but yeah, I'm sorry about that. So some question to ask yourself if something is successful as art is, did it force a change in you, or did it instigate a change in you? A lot of the times people have told me that when they go through this process with a piece of art that they're seeing for the first time, or even a piece of art that they really did not like the first time they interacted with it, when they go through this process, describing it, analyzing it, and interpreting it, they begin appreciating it more. And then that shows them that they've changed their minds. It's expanded their horizons a little bit. So the art is successful in that way as well. Also, does the art have an intrinsic value? Does do its elements contribute to the value of the work? Does it feel like it's important? If it's work that you've made yourself, is it important to your growth as an individual or an artist? Even if you are going to dismiss something you've made yourself as not being quote unquote good enough or not being quote unquote perfect, if it helped you to grow somehow or expand your horizons a bit, it has given you specific value. So those are the 4 steps of artistic critique, and it's something that I want you to really ponder as you go through that section. Now, I'm going to show you something that you probably have not seen before. I'm pretty sure you probably haven't. We look at this, we can dismiss it as an old painting and just move on. Or we can start looking at it using those 4 tools of artistic critique. Describing it, it looks like it's a very distorted scene that is meant to represent something that actually happened. On the left, we have 2 people dressed up as monks. In the middle, we have somebody who may very well represent an angel. On the far right, we have somebody who looks like dressed as a sultan, surrounded by advisors and a guard. The title of this is, I believe, St. Francis meets the Sultan Al-Kamil, Malik Al-Kamil. And we can see that from the style, it looks like it was painted a significant length of time ago, probably 600-700 years ago, maybe. And we can see that this architectural feature here represents something of a palace. And we can see that St. Francis and his friend right here are standing outside, approaching this person on his throne that is sheltered by something of the palace. If we analyze this, we can look at it and say, well, it was painted, and it was painted very specifically to mimic the real world. Here's some plants in the background that are painted to look like real trees, and because of that, we can identify these trees as living in a desert environment. Now, the story behind this painting is that this actual meeting happened in northern Egypt, so this is an indicator of that. The artist chose those plants specifically to indicate that. We can see different colors that are designed to engage your eyes and draw attention to different elements. Like here, St. Francis is in rather clothed in rather drab colors, but he's holding this gold cross, and his face is right in front of this dark circle. So our eyes are drawn to it. This angel, the hair is colored in such a way that it frames her face, and so we're drawn to that as well. And then Mehmet al-Kamil, Malik al-Kamil, he's wearing gold robes, indicative of his position as a ruler. And the other colors around him frame his face, so our eyes are drawn to that as well. So the artist is using color and texture in the painting to help us follow along with our eyes the high points of the narrative. Now, in interpreting this, well, I because of the way that the objects are shown, and because of the kind of distorted way that perspective is used, I think that the artist wants us to pay attention to the narrative and be aware of the story more than the artist wants us to appreciate it as a beautiful, naturalistic, realistic rendering. I think that would be very appropriate. Because of that, if we're supposed to pay attention to the narrative, then we can see that these two people, it's obvious that they are approaching this person. They're not bowing down, so they're not being submissive, but they're not being haughty either. They're not being prideful. They're being very rational and reasonable and calm as they approach Malik al-Kamil. The angel seems to be standing to the side, not participating directly, but by her looks, maybe encouraging St. Francis. And if we look over here, we look at these two advisors right here. They're both, this one is looking at Malik al-Kamil, this one is looking at St. Francis, but they're both kind of standing back a little bit, getting ready to say something, maybe to respond somehow, but they're keeping their peace for the most part. And Malik al-Kamil looks like he's really excited to interact with Francis. And so, and that's what the narrative is about, actually. Malik al-Kamil was the ruler of Egypt. The Fifth Crusade was underway. The Christian troops were just outside of his city, getting ready to attack and start another world war, essentially. And St. Francis felt that the Christian, or the truly religious path, was to avoid violent conflict and not to resolve things with the sword. But he felt that everything could be resolved through reasoned interaction. And he felt that Malik al-Kamil was obviously an intelligent person, and by reasoning with him, he could either convince Malik al-Kamil to join his faith or to stop the conflict. And Malik was really intrigued by the bravery of this unarmed man to walk through a war zone specifically just to talk to him. And so that's what opened his heart to listen to St. Francis. And the two actually were both very intelligent. They were both reasoned. And through their conversation, what amounts to their first interaction being a 2-hour conversation, they ultimately ended the Fifth Crusade. They ended the world wars because they chose to talk to each other. And that's what the story is about. And I think that that's amazing. Now, the artist of this is Christian. This is imagery in the panel back here is consistent with Christian imagery of the time. And what the artist seems to be implying is that Malik al-Kamil was a good person. He was not an evil person. And since both of them are interacting in what looks like a positive way, I think the artist is implying as well that positive interaction through intelligent conversation is something that could very well be looked over by an angel. So it's something to consider. And then when we go to evaluate, is it successful? I think it is. It communicates a narrative. It communicates a very positive message that conversation can resolve issues when both people respect the other. So it's something to think about. So we talked about, as we are exploring art, using those 4 tools of artistic critique, I want you to also be aware of this vocabulary that's in the module. The elements of art, line, texture, color, plane, light and value, volume and shape, form and mass, time and motion. And principles of design, balance, unity and harmony, variety and contrast, emphasis and focal point, repetition and rhythm, or movement, scale, and proportion. When we're talking about this, we need to be precise. We need to communicate what we're seeing, how we're analyzing it, how we're interpreting it, and our evaluation. And we communicate that using precise language. And when you do this, when you get into the habit of doing it, it also helps you to appreciate what we see and when we interact with art as well. And when you adapt this to other things, like in your job and other elements of your academic career, you'll be able to adjust that language to be more precise with the thing that you are describing at the moment. When you go to home for Thanksgiving and somebody asks you why you're wasting time in an art class, you can pull this out and use this to actually absolutely blow them away, describing anything in the house using these 4 steps of artistic critique. I challenge you to keep this in mind and try that when you get home for Thanksgiving or any other interaction. Another thing I wanted to talk about today, in addition to that, was a little bit of something called flow state. Now, I know that all of you have experienced this, but you may know it by different things. Whatever field that you're engaged in, whatever you're excited about, whatever you do or enjoy doing, especially as a hobby or when you're trying to get away from things, or when you're concentrating really hard, you have all had an experience where you open your eyes and it dawns on you that significant time has passed, that maybe the sun has gone down, maybe the sun has gone up, that maybe a foot is asleep, maybe you can no longer feel your hand because you've been sitting the same way for so long. What happens is our minds will concentrate so thoroughly on a specific thing that we disregard pretty much all other input. Like when you're, even if you're gaming online, for example, and somebody has to interrupt you several times to get your attention, and you're finally irritated because you have to literally yank yourself out of the game that you're working in, or that you were in just moments before. Or we get in a rhythm where we start just engaging in the rhythm and completely ignore all other sensory input. All of you have had that. But that flow state is important for a couple reasons. One is we can engage that flow state and access our creative powers more effectively. We can also engage that flow state to resolve issues. If you're at work and you have to do something and get something done, you can engage that flow state and really buckle down and focus on whatever it is that you're doing, and it helps you to get it done. So it does work for other things as well. But I think it also, if we keep that thought in the back of our mind, it may help us to appreciate what other people do. When we're interacting with art that somebody else has done, if we can see that there's a lot of polishing that happened, or there's a lot of this kind of engagement of texture or that, and we can, through our analysis, we can see that they spent a lot of time on it, then we can appreciate the flow state that they engaged in. And maybe that will open another window of understanding, or at least appreciation, in the artwork that we're examining. Now, flow state is something that we can bring about on purpose. I know that some of you are going to be athletes, and when you are engaged in practice as an athlete, you can engage flow state fairly quickly sometimes. If you are working in music, or actually anything that you do, when you get to the point where you're so focused on what you're doing that you dismiss other things, that is engaging the state of flow. Now, what's fascinating to me is this kind of intense focus is more indicative of how people gauge happiness or consider themselves to be happy than pretty much any other set of circumstances. I don't know why that is, but it does seem to be consistent. A lot of people can have the things that we would think not having them would contribute to happiness, and they don't truly feel happy because they haven't achieved that level of connection with anything, or at least that level of connection with anything for any sustained period of time. What is sad is people who are wealthy may not be happy. People that are married or in a long-term committed relationship may not be happy because for whatever reason, they aren't engaging with that kind of level of focus. That was something that was discovered that seemed to be consistent with the observations by somebody named Csikszentmihalyi. And it's his work on the flow state and how that contributes to happiness is an interesting thing to read. So when you go through that section, read about that and look at all the kinds of things that he took into account. Because it is fascinating to me that seems to be consistent with how people self-report levels of happiness. And I don't know if it applies just to happiness. I think it also applies to satisfaction. If we feel content, I think it has things to do with that as well. When you engage in the assignments on this, well, there is a quiz, and that reflects directly on the readings and discussion we've had. Then I want you to write a little bit about artistic inspiration. What does that mean to you? Now, inspiration comes from Latin spiritus, which means breath, and that's where we get that phrase from. Turkish calligraphers, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, traditional Turkish calligraphy, you'll breathe out every time you make a stroke with the pen. You're imbuing somehow the creation that you've made with life, with that breath. But we can also engage that breath on different levels. Inspiration can come from many different sources, but I think it contributes significantly to whether or not something can be considered art, because it's that breath that comes from outside of our limited present mind. As you engage in the two assignments for this week, the drawing simple designs, and then again, drawing the upside down horse, what I want you to do is try not to see this as objects that are unrelatable. One way to do the simple design process is to very lightly draw a grid on this image, print it out, draw a grid on it, and then draw on your paper in your sketchbook or whatever you're going to be using a similar grid with the same proportions. And then instead of paying attention to the overall design, pay attention to each grid square and just translate each grid square over. When you're done with that, go over the lines you want to keep with a pen, and when the ink dries, erase the grid that you sketched on it. And that will, what you're doing is kind of divorcing or separating yourself from that anxious need to copy something, and you're dividing it up into smaller tasks that you can focus on by separating it into smaller grid squares. And each smaller grid square will have a much simpler, easier design. And as you focus on those, that will help you to draw the larger, more complex design. This is actually a technique that was used as far back, well, as far as I know there's records of, as far back as when the Egyptians, artists created the drawings on their tombs. They would use this thing. They would do smaller scale drawings, and they would go up, scale it up by making a grid design and copy each smaller element of the grid onto the tomb wall. Now, the second exercise is an upside down horse. Now, I keep saying upside down horse. It doesn't have to be an upside down horse. It can be anything. And if you separate yourself from the idea that it is a more complicated thing, and again, you just kind of lightly draw a grid over it and transfer the grid points, that will help quite a bit. If you separate it from needing to be a horse and just draw the lines in relationship to each other, that helps quite a bit too. And if you disengage yourself from the amount of time that you're taking and just focus on the lines, that really helps quite a bit. So both of these exercises, they are simple, they are easy, but if we don't apply some way to engage your focus in a way to remove from your mind the anxiety of that larger design, it can be difficult. So I would suggest using that grid kind of pattern idea, drawing a grid over the original image, drawing a grid on your blank page, transferring grid scars over. That's one way of doing it. And then another way of doing it is divorcing yourself entirely from the idea that it needs to be a picture and just draw the shapes you see. Do the best you can, see which way works best for you, and send me submit the thing that works out the best. Whatever that process ends up being. When we work to kind of separate ourselves from meaning or the anxiety of trying to have to get things to fit, when we start concentrating on small portions like just this single line or this single grid square, that helps us to narrow our focus to the point where we can engage that sense of flow better. And the sense of flow helps us to create things, I think, much better than we would otherwise. So think about those things. I didn't see any real questions that people had in the emails. Please try, if at all possible, to set aside time next week for meeting together on Tuesday afternoon. And I would like to have people meet here live, as many as possible. That will really help us to, as we engage with the material, and to ask questions, answer questions, and to reflect on what we're looking at. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, but please do the best you can. If you can, come live to the next meeting. That'd be awesome. All right, well, thank you very much. I hope this has helped this week, and we will talk more next week with the next stage in our art careers as we go on. Now, I really don't want anybody to feel the pressure of trying to quote unquote be a good artist. You're already a good artist at whatever career it is that you do, and the evidence of that is that you're continuing to do it. And if you're happy with it, that's even better. But every person can be an artist when you engage something outside of your immediate self as an element of the process of whatever it is you're doing. So I want you to think about that. But I look forward to engaging with you next week. And I hope in the meantime, have a really good weekend, particularly with the holiday coming up. Stay extra safe, please, so that everybody makes it back on Tuesday. All right? We'll look forward to seeing you then.